with oilseed rape does give you good options for weed control all the way out through the autumn and into winter there as well. So I suppose if it is a situation where you can't get your pre-em on, it's by no means the end of the world. There are plenty of options. The first option really starts with non-chemical control, and that's, I suppose, getting your stale seedbed correct.
The next cropping season is just around the corner. Planning the most suitable rotation on your farm is critical to maximising profitability and resilience. Maximising the highest financial margin crops is an aim on all farms, but constraints such as soil-borne disease or rotational slots will dictate the final mix. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the podcast, then please follow and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Oilseed rape has been a consistent crop, returning one of the highest margins of all crops in the past 5 years. Global forward prices are also high at the moment, and both factors will entice more acreage this year. I'm delighted today to be joined by Eoin Lyons, a tillage advisor in Laois, and Ciarán Collins, a tillage specialist in Cork, to chat about oilseed rape and how to get the best from it in your rotation. Ciarán, I just want to come to you first and maybe just go back and talk a little bit about the harvest 2026 and how oilseed rape performed.
I would say across the board, Michael, generally quite good. I suppose in a harvest that we've had a lot of variability. I think oilseed rape is the one that's bucked that trend. I think yield has been quite solid. Okay, you might have a range of 1.7 maybe to 2.2 or 3, but I think there's a very tight average in around that 1.9, even up to 2 tons, So, it's been a really solid performer and kind of backing up, I suppose, recent years really in terms of yield,
Any flies in the ointment at all, Ciarán? It was a very dry harvest. Was there any difficulties there? Or, look, it was just one of those years and should have got it into the tank anyway?
Yeah, no, it was obviously very dry in the end. I suppose something that we wouldn't kind of seen that much in the past, but we'd green stubble after harvesting almost, and that the grain was ripe, moisture's dropped very, very quickly, even though some of the stems were actually a little bit green. I suppose that was something that we wouldn't normally see. But no, other than that, I think it was a kind of a solid year. Maybe some of the lower yields, and we'll talk about establishment in a minute, maybe, look where we've sown maybe a little bit later or pigeons got added, something like that. But look, in general, you'd have to say very, very solid performance, really.
Solid and very good. And Owen, I suppose, given the fact that prices have increased for oilseed rape going forward, like for next year, the forward price looks pretty good, certainly higher than last year. Maybe that's a lot of farmers are going to be thinking about, look, it's been very solid, high price on the other side. Maybe I should expand my oilseed rape acreage.
Definitely going to be a consideration anyway. Like, it is similar to in the Midlands. Around here, like most crops, you could say on average we're nearly back a half ton to the acre, but the oilseed rape seem to just maintain where it should be, even when cut at very low moistures, to be fair as well. So it's definitely on the no, it's definitely an option going forward that people will be thinking of, because when you look at the margins, it is the one there that's standing out in front. I suppose just one area of caution with it, like you do have to maintain your rotation with it. Like, it is a 1 year in 5 crops, so like I would caution on people, going and looking at increasing their area and then maybe being caught out in the next maybe 2, 3, 4 years where you've run out of room for it in your rotation. You do have to kind of, I suppose, look to see where it's going to fit in and kind of maintain the area going forward, rather than jumping in with a large area this year just because it looks so attractive. I suppose the other side of it too is, an awful lot of farmers around here now, they're a part of the acre scheme or part of the EIP scheme, and they're sowing maybe brassica cover crops as well. I suppose that is a consideration there as well. If you have a history of sort of brassica cover crops in your rotation for the past few years, it might rule out oilseed rape in particular fields. So there's a lot of different things there to consider just in looking at maybe a high price going forward.
And why, Owen, is it ruling out oilseed rape? Is it because they're committed to the scheme or other issues?
Well, look, yeah, part of it is committed to the scheme. Maybe there's a certain amount of land there is kind of put to that, and it has to be put back into a spring crop. But I suppose more so from an agronomy point of view is, are you going to build club root in them fields? Has that brassica cover crop started to build club root, and will it come through in the oilseed rape crop? And we're seeing that already. We've been, I think the GLOS scheme came in 2015, so we're over 10 years now growing, I suppose, cover crops on a larger scale. And we can see it popping up now in in oilseed rape crops for the past few years, club root issues. And I suppose we do get club root, it means that that root can't access the nutrients that the plant needs in order to yield. So it will have a major impact on yield. And it could also rule out oilseed rape for a long number of years in them particular fields as well. So it's really something you don't want coming into your field. So you really have to give consideration where you're going planting your oilseed rape. And it's not just about this year. It's, it's 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road you really have to be thinking of.
And how would a farmer assess if there is club root in their ground or not? Is there a lab test or anything simpler than that?
Well, really, you could just look and see if you have a cover crop there, if you go out and try and see, is there symptoms of club root on the roots? And I suppose that will give a good idea of whether it is there or not if you do have a brassica cover crop there.
And obviously, they could probably do it in the oilseed rape that's already been harvested this year. It's easy enough to go
Correct.
out there and
Yes.
have a look at it.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other suggestion would be if they know of a spot in the farm that has lowish pH, the chance there is going to be there quicker than anywhere else. So a couple of those. Just in terms of Ciarán, to bring you in there in terms of varieties, there's a lot of information there. There's certainly the department information, but there's other information from seed suppliers from the UK. Because it's a relatively big crop out there. What's the most or the best, I suppose, spot to try and compare the vast myriad of varieties that are available out there?
Yeah, look, sure. Like everything nowadays, there's a myriad of information sources, but look, like no different to cereals, you'd have to say the department recommended list has to be the one that you go to first because, you're comparing varieties grown in conditions in Ireland, on different sites across the country in the tillage areas. And that's the ultimate one, before we, if I go back a long number of years ago, before we had a comprehensive list from from the department, we often grew varieties that perform well, say in the UK, for argument's sake, and that didn't translate here. So we know that. But look, we're fortunate. We have a very comprehensive recommended list. And in fairness to the seed companies, they would be supplying their best material in there, and most of the stuff that's available to purchase is on that list as well. But look, mentioned the seed companies, they do provide a lot of information themselves as well, through their open days and booklets, and there's a lot of very, very good information there.
So over the last number of years, Ciarán, I suppose the improvement in some of these oilseed rape varieties has been a step change almost every other second year. There's something new there. It's better improvement out there. Before we probably would have been talking about, the yield capacity of it, would have definitely been talking about light leaf spot as some of the key things to look at for the variety you're going to choose in your farm. Has that changed any, or are we looking at different parameters now?
Yeah, I suppose firstly to say, oilseed rape has led the way in breeding technology. That's the first thing. I mean, you have so many traits now that are covered off in the breeding. And I think, like if you just mention some of them, you have pod shatter resistance, that was one of the first. We've turnip yellow virus resistance, we've foma resistance. There's, there's improvements, we'll say, with sclerotinia, and then we can come back to maybe club root and maybe Clearfield there in a second. But I think for me, when you look at the recommended list now, or even the 1 year results from this year, I was just looking at it there a while ago, there's a very narrow spectrum in terms of yield. It's a high yield, but I think it's those traits that has brought about that sort of uniformity in yield, from, kind of the control at 100, you're looking at maybe from 99 to 102, 103. So you're not getting these 95s on the recommended list and 105, so, and that's down to the breeding technology that's there, and it's able to secure that yield, I suppose, is the best way of putting it.
So are you saying they're all pretty good and there's little to choose between them? So, get the one that's closest to you kind of thing?
Well, sure, it's never as simple as that, I suppose. You always look at something that's growing well in your area or on your farm, and again, the recommended list is a good guide. And look, not all varieties carry the same traits, and I suppose that's one to maybe look out for, we'll say take foma resistance or maybe even sclerotinia there's some improvements there. So, if you have maybe a slight or tight rotation or you had sclerotinia maybe in the past or something, that's something you might look at. So there is certainly, different traits there. But in my book, I suppose light leaf spot is one of the key traits. So that is one I would be keeping a close eye on. And, light leaf spot is the one that will rob yield on you. So, don't pick a variety with a low rating for light leaf spot.
So two of the other things you might have kind of mentioned there already, but two other things that are out there and available in terms of varieties. One is Clearfield, which are sown in areas where Charlock or Prashuk might be a problem, and the other one is clubroot resistant varieties. Building in those particular traits into it, has that dragged the yield at all, or can growers expect similar yields with those type varieties?
Yeah, so I suppose the improvements that we've spoken about already and all those traits like pod chatter, turnip yellow virus, all of those, they've all obviously brought that those yield increases. Now, if you're looking for club root resistance or maybe the Clearfield varieties to deal with a brassica situation, there certainly is a yield lag coming there, and you don't always have those traits. And there, that technology to breeding that say that club root resistance takes a little bit longer, and you do certainly get a yield lag there. So, and clubroot, to mention it, like it is something to be very careful of. Just to back up what Owen said, we're year on year seeing more clubroot, whether that's to do with maybe the increase in oilseed rape area, whether that's to do with brassica cover crops. I'm not 100% sure yet, but it is something to keep a close eye on. But look, there is options there in those clubroot resistant varieties, or if you're dealing with brassicas in terms of Clearfield. But just to be aware that there is that yield lag, and you won't be getting the same yields as with the other varieties, really.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose I was talking to a colleagues of ours here in Oak Park, and those clubroot resistant varieties seem to perform quite well this year in Oak Park. So,
Mm.
certainly an option out there. Owen, I wanted to bring you in here in terms of establishment systems. I suppose this year we're quite unique. I suppose that around the country the harvest is all but over, and people have plenty of time to get oilseed rape in at their leisure, I suppose, or pretty much at their leisure. Whereas in other years we were very much in the middle of harvest, and it was a struggle, and people had to be creative, I suppose, in how they were going to get oilseed rape in. So does it really, like, there's probably plenty of time for people to either plough or min till or strip till or kind of do whatever they like. Is there a big difference in terms of the outcomes of all these systems, or does it matter that much?
I look from experience on the ground and also the trial work that we would have seen in Oak Park that there is really not much difference in final yield in relation to any of the different cultivation or establishment systems. But I suppose the key thing there is that there is different management at zone that you kind of have to follow if you are depending on which system that you're going to take. I suppose we are like, the general zone date of oilseed rape is kind of anywhere from now in the north, in the northeast, anywhere up until kind of mid-September down in the south. So there is a range there of its own day depending on your location. I think this year could be slightly different given that we are in a situation where seabeds are so dry. To do any cultivation around where I am in Laois or South Kildare is very difficult at the moment. Now we've got a small bit of rain there Tuesday night into Wednesday, but it really will not make much difference as things stand. Um, so really, look, your establishment system will depend on the system that I suppose best suits machinery you have or what you have in your farm. Really, from the trial work that was done in Oak Park, it would show, as I said, the different systems don't show much difference when it comes to final yield. I suppose if you are in a plough or a min-till situation, you're trying to create that fine seed bed, which I suppose might be easier in that type of system. But I know some people also like to use maybe a subsoiler type system as well, where they have wide rows, maybe anywhere up to 500 millimeter rows. Um, and in that scenario, and especially this year where we might have a very dry soil, a system like that might have the tendency maybe to bring up very cloddy type soil. And are you going to get that fine, firm seedbed that you require in that scenario? Will the clods kind of come in around where the sowing, where the seed is being placed and affect establishment? So I think in a system like that, if you're not getting where the kind of fine, firm seedbed that you might like, you might have to look it up when you're seeding maybe by 10 or 15%. I suppose another consideration with oilseed rape is, I suppose we often think of the plant in the springtime when it's growing rapidly and it's putting out loads of shoots and how vigorous it can grow. But at that early type stage when it's trying to establish, it can be it's not great in compacted soils. We really have to take that into account that if you do have compaction, your establishment could be affected. Now, look, I suppose given the year that we have, as you said, Michael, we do have plenty of time, given that the harvest is wrapped up, and soils are so dry. It is absolutely ideal at the moment if subsoiling has to take place that it can take place. So I suppose that is a consideration as well. But a compacted soil, you're just not going to get good establishment with Oilseed.
And with those dry seed beds in mind, I think a lot of farmers would be very nervous about going in and planting oilseed rape until those soils wet up a little bit. Is it not to stick you to it necessarily, but you're talking about kind of a day's rain before it's, there's a decent amount of moisture there, so that when you get that even emergence and you have everything's more consistent rather than a kind of patchy emergence over time.
I think we're talking about a nice bit of rain anyway, because I think at the moment around here we're up to maybe 70, 80 mil of a soil moisture deficit. So soils are incredibly dry at the moment. And really, you would have seen in previous years maybe where, you would have planted your oilseed rape and then you get a small bit of rain, maybe the rape tries to establish and you kind of have maybe a third establishment today, a third of the crop maybe in a week's time and so on. And you end up with multiple crops at different stage within the one crop. And it can make treatment of different, at different stages throughout the autumn very difficult. So I think, I think you do need a significant amount of rain, and hopefully a nice bit of rain may be coming afterwards as well after planting. But in my own view, maybe calendar date mightn't be as critical this year, maybe as other dates when it comes to your sowing time. Given that soils are so warm at the minute and there's so much heat in the soil, you might just get away, you might get that burst of growth after sowing, even maybe later into September. But again, that's very critical based on your location as well. What we'll get away in the Midlands, you might not get away in the Northeast and so on down the south, down to Cork as well. So it's just to keep that in mind that maybe, don't rush out if conditions aren't perfect. You might get away with maybe a few days or a week later than normal.
It's a small seed and expensive as well. You got to put it into right conditions. And Kieran, with that in mind, in terms of having the right conditions there, should growers consider applying some fertilizer as a kind of a starter fertilizer to the oilseed rape to kind of get it up and running?
Yeah, I think so. Now, there's a couple of things really. I suppose oilseed rape, of all the crops that we could sow in the autumn, is the most efficient to utilize nitrogen, So I suppose, if you have had lower yielding crops or lower than expected yields this year, maybe relative to the amount of fertilizer you put out, nitrogen you put out this year, there may be somewhat of a soil nitrogen reserve, which can help the oilseed rape a little bit. But I think organic manures really, and I know not everybody will have access to organic manures, but if you do, there's a lot of advantages to organic manures. Firstly, it will help the establishment of the crop. You could supply some or all of its P and K requirement, and like that bit of nitrogen in the autumn to get that forward growth into the winter and then out to the following spring is hugely valuable because firstly, it'll help establishment. It also prevents the likes of pigeon grazing because you've built a bigger canopy, and then in the spring, you can build your green area index, and there can be significant savings. Like some growers last year saved up to €200 a hectare on their nitrogen simply because they got organic manures out in the autumn. So, definitely if organic manures are available, they should be considered. Now you have to factor in the cost. You have the cost maybe of haulage and spreading and all of that. So that's a sum for each individual grower depending on what's available and how far away it is, So I think it would be organic manures really would be the key one just to drive that autumn growth. And like Owen said there, I'd be waiting. I certainly wouldn't do this by calendar of all years. There's a bit of warmth in the soil at the moment. It's certainly going to need moisture. And if you are using organic manures, just to remember that you need to cultivate them in immediately. We want to hold on to as much of that nitrogen that will be available to the crop as possible. So again, you're going to need a bit of moisture before you'll be able to do that as well.
So in terms of, Kieran, the organic manures, if they're available, say a person had a multitude of ones available, is there any organic manures that are more suitable or less suitable than others, or does it matter at all?
Well, I suppose there's two ends to it. If you can get something that'll balance your P and K requirements, that's good, and that obviously starts with a soil test. We don't like putting out a lot of nitrogen in the autumn because, especially for obviously before cereals, but even oilseed rape, there's a limit. So, having said that, oilseed rape is probably is good at utilizing some of the higher end ones. But if I was to pick one, maybe pig slurry is probably one that's very suitable for oilseed rape, really. But look, poultry litter can work as well, but just be careful of the amount that you apply.
So you're talking about maybe somewhere in the region of, I don't know, 2,500 gallons of pig slurry?
2,000 to 2,500 gallons
2.5.
is a
And
good mix. Yeah,
and I
yeah,
have seen in the past where people have been using some of the poultry litter maybe at a very strong rate. I kind of thought that people should be, I suppose, conscious that maybe somewhere around 2.5 to 2 tons an acre is more than sufficient, is it?
yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there's no point in oversupplying. There's only so much growth that you're going to get, in that autumn winter period. So again, there's certainly no advantage in oversupplying in the autumn. No,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
it's detrimental looking in terms of we'll get losses and runoff and that.
Water quality and everything else associated with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Owen, I just want to come back to you in terms of weed control, which is a job, I suppose, traditionally for oilseed rape that would be carried out very shortly after planting with some of the pre-emerge herbicides. Does this become a more tricky operation this year because of that really dry soil?
Yeah, look, absolutely it does. I suppose there's a short answer to that. Any pre-emergence herbicide, you're going to need a certain amount of moisture in the seedbed in order for it to activate and to get good control and good soil contact. If we don't have that, it is going to be very limited. But look, I suppose with oilseed rape, it does give you good options for weed control all the way out through to the autumn and into winter there as well. So I suppose if it is a situation where you can't get your pre-em on, it's by no means the end of the world. There are plenty of options. I suppose, look, the first option really starts with non-chemical control, and that's, I suppose, getting your stale seedbed correct. Now, I was out with one grower this week, and we are just assessing those winter barley stubbles that had been cultivated post-harvest to try and create that stale seedbed to get the brome growing or the volunteer cereals. Now, look, like everything with no rain, there was very little of the coming through. So we were kind of estimating maybe 20-25% of what volunteers may be there in the seabed have actually germinated. So unfortunately, look, you're going to have them coming through in the LC Ray probably anyway. But I suppose, look, that's not the end of the world. There is options. So any of your graminicides there in the icy rape crop, kind of after establishment, not too far after establishment, will take them out. I suppose that is very important because we know that if there is a high volume of volunteers, they are very competitive early on, and then they can kind of pull down your target plant population, the rape. So that is kind of a major thing to kind of be aware of.
So you're saying you're saying kind of go with those relatively early when the volunteer cereals are only at a young stage, 2 or 3 leaf stage, or a bit more?
Yeah, kind of a two-leaf stage. And I think, it's just maybe, in years gone past where you would have got your stale seedbed done after your winter barley and you would have got them volunteers growing and we took them out with our roundup or whatever before we drilled. It probably wasn't as big of a deal, but there is going to be an awful lot of volunteers still to germinate when we do eventually get the rain, and they're going to come up when we have to take care of them early on and play as the oilseed rape is establishment. Okay,
Okay.
so look at um generally, look, if we do get kind of a good seabed that has plenty of moisture there, you're kind of going with your catamaran turbo as your preem. Follow up with your graminicide like your falcons or any of these to take care of your volunteers, especially, but also other grass weeds. But I suppose if that doesn't happen, we're still going to go with our graminicide. That'll be our first herbicide. And then we could come back. There's other options, maybe like Belcar there later on as a post-emergence option to take care of some of our broadleaf weeds. And then later on into the winter when the temperatures cool down, we've Astrocurb there as an extremely good option as well for taking care of other grass weeds. So look, as I said, just to recap, if the seabed is not good enough to get on your pre-em, don't worry, there's plenty of options going forward.
Plenty of options from there on in. So, Kieran, final question to you. This year is an odd year. Maybe every year is an odd year. I'm not really sure, but maybe we look more like the UK than we do Ireland of normal, I suppose. So given those really dry seed beds, are we likely to have less problems with slugs and maybe more problems with some of the other problematic weeds to have in England, such as cabbage stem flea beetle or that kind of thing?
Well, slugs, I suppose, number one to deal with that. Like, I mean, field history is always a very good guide. Now, as you say, look, the drier conditions, you certainly that's going to put them down. Now, look, but I feel history is always a very, very good guide. But you may look, if it gets wet after, does slugs will appear. Cabbage stem flea beetle obviously has been a massive issue in the UK. Thankfully, it has been a very, very small issue here. We haven't seen a whole lot of it. I think the key to it there is just monitoring. Like, so people will see or be familiar with the like shot holing, the little holes in the leaves, as distinct from slugs, is more like a bite out of the leaf, whereas the cabbage stem flea beetle is more like this shot holing. So I would be just keeping keeping an eye on it. Like, there are thresholds up to 25% of the leaf area at the true two leaf stage, and then if more than 50% of the area is affected, up to the 3 to 4 leaf stage. That's kind of the thresholds for treatment. So treatment would be, with a pyrethroid like Karate or Teagasc or one of those. But as I said, it hasn't been an issue in Ireland for a while. But just something to monitor, really. I certainly wouldn't be treating it without seeing any symptoms anyhow.
Okay, listen, thanks very much, guys. That's probably all we've time for. We kind of gave a good run through the basics, I suppose, and things to look out for. And look, there's lots more information on the website there as well. So, Ciarán and Eoin, thanks very much for your time, and we'll be chatting to you again.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Ciarán and Eoin for joining me on the show. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.